Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened at Gate C-14 on a night that never should have gone this way. Desmond Farrow was 43 years old, and to anyone who knew him casually, he was a freelance logistics consultant who worked from a cluttered home office in Columbus, Ohio, drove a pickup truck with too many miles on it, made his own coffee every morning, and never talked much about money. He skipped the galas his neighbors mentioned in passing, declined most invitations because he was always, apparently, in the middle of something that couldn't wait. What almost nobody knew, not his neighbors, not his in-laws, barely a dozen people in the world, was that Desmond was the founder and controlling owner of Ridgeline Aviation Group, a private holding company worth just over $2 billion, structured through a trust and layered equity arrangement that kept his name off every public document. He hadn't built it to hide from anyone. He'd built it because he grew up watching his mother stretch a grocery budget until it screamed, and he swore that once he made something real, no one would ever be able to take it from her. When it finally became real, more than real, he found the secrecy had turned into something else entirely, a test he wasn't ready to end. His mother, Louise Farrow, had raised him alone in a small town outside Duluth, Minnesota, working the register at a hardware store for 30 years, teaching him that the size of a thing mattered less than whether you'd built it honestly. She used to drive him out to the fence at the edge of the regional airport on weekends just to watch planes take off, not because she understood lift or thrust, but because she wanted him to see that things could leave the ground. When he was 14, she'd given him a small brass key on a leather cord, told him it didn't open anything real, just something she wanted him to carry, a reminder that no matter how far he traveled, there was always a door back home waiting for him. He still wore it under his shirt, every single day since. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was finishing a routine safety review at Ridgeline's headquarters. Louise had suffered a stroke and passed quickly. A neighbor found her that morning. Desmond booked the last commercial seat to Minneapolis that evening, a connecting flight up to Duluth the following morning in time for the funeral. He didn't use his ownership to pull a favor or bump anyone off a charter. That felt wrong to him in a way he never had to explain to himself. He just booked the seat like anyone else would have, the way he always insisted on doing. What he didn't know was that his wife, Renee, had already logged into their shared travel account and canceled it. Desmond and Renee had met 11 years earlier, back when Ridgeline was 2 leased aircraft and a folding table in a rented hangar. She'd worked in corporate event planning, and in those early years, she'd liked the way he looked at broken systems. Like every one of them was a puzzle nobody else had bothered to solve. He thought at the time it was the most perceptive thing anyone had ever said about him. Things had shifted slowly after that, the way they sometimes do. Renee moved into partnership development a few years into the marriage and found a world where the right name on a contact list mattered more than almost anything else. She started paying attention to who drove what, who sat where at events, whose name opened doors. The modest, work-from-home version of her husband that had once seemed refreshingly grounded started to look, through her new eyes, like a ceiling he'd never gotten past. Somewhere in the last 2 years, a man named Trevor Aldrich had entered her professional circle, an investment consultant with a leased sports car, tailored suits, and an endless supply of deals that never quite closed. Desmond had quietly asked his finance team to run a background check when Trevor's name started coming up too often, in too many contexts that mattered. What they found wasn't criminal, just hollow. 2 failed pitches to Ridgeline's own investment partners, a lifestyle financed almost entirely by revolving personal loans and leased assets. Everything Trevor presented as ownership was borrowed. Desmond hadn't told Renee. He'd told himself he was giving her room to see it on her own, that maybe, foolishly, she was still capable of arriving at the truth herself. In reality, he'd been waiting for a version of her that might already be gone. When Desmond arrived at Prairie Fields International that evening, his boarding app showed a canceled reservation. He assumed it was a glitch and walked to the gate to sort it out in person. That's when he saw them. Renee stood near the gate entrance in travel clothes, Trevor beside her holding a boarding pass, both of them dressed for a trip Renee had mentioned earlier that week as a networking getaway to Minneapolis, a detail Desmond had registered and set aside because his mother had just died and nothing else had felt important enough to hold on to. He recognized the seat number on Trevor's boarding pass immediately. It had been his. "What happened to my reservation?" he asked. Renee didn't look away. She told him plainly that she'd canceled his booking and applied the refund toward upgrading Trevor's economy seat to first class, because appearing in coach wasn't the image they needed for the meetings ahead. She said it the way you explain something to someone you've already decided doesn't deserve a gentler version of the truth. No rush in her voice at all. "Your mother won't know the difference," she said. "The dead don't check the guest list." Desmond stood there with his hand closing around the brass key beneath his shirt. The flight was full. The next one wouldn't land until after the funeral had ended. A gate agent nearby, her name tag reading Denise Okafor, watched with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to stay quiet when a passenger was having the worst night of his life. Desmond thought, for one long moment, about walking away, finding a rental car, driving through the night, arriving too late to do anything but stand at the edge of a cemetery in the dark after everyone else had gone home. He thought about the voicemail from his mother he'd never opened, sitting in his phone for 2 weeks because every time her name lit up the screen, something in his chest locked shut before he could press play. He walked to Denise's counter instead. "I need you to access the internal ownership verification portal," he said quietly, setting nothing down but his hand flat on the counter, "and check the name on my ID against the registered controlling owner of Ridgeline Aviation Group." Denise looked at him the way people look at someone they're deciding whether to humor or call security on. Then she typed, her fingers moving through the standard motions of a request she'd fielded 100 times before, this time landing somewhere entirely different. Her expression changed all at once, not gradually. She reached for the desk phone without taking her eyes off the screen and asked to be connected to the airport operations director, then asked for him specifically, not whoever happened to answer. Behind him, Desmond heard Renee say his name, but it sounded different this time, thinner. For nearly 4 minutes, Denise stayed on that call while the gate remained open and the jet bridge door stayed unlocked. Renee crossed the space between them, lowering her voice into the register she used when she wanted something to sound like a warning without quite becoming one. She told Denise that her husband had a habit of making dramatic gestures when he was embarrassed, that whatever name he'd given probably didn't mean what he thought it meant, that this delay was going to cause real problems for everyone involved. Denise kept the phone to her ear and didn't respond, and that silence told Desmond more than any words could have. Trevor drifted closer to the gate door, unbothered, glancing at his watch like a man mildly annoyed by a weather delay he was certain wouldn't touch him. He hadn't looked at Desmond directly once since the confrontation began. The operations director arrived 6 minutes later with a representative from the airline's regional office, both moving with the brisk care of people who'd been told something they needed to confirm with their own eyes before they'd fully believe it. He asked Denise to step aside, check the screen himself, then turned to Desmond with an expression that had completely rearranged itself from the one he'd walked in wearing. "Mr. Farrow," he said, "the verification portal returned a match. You're the controlling owner of Ridgeline Aviation Group. This aircraft operates under your holding structure." The gate went silent. Renee made a sound Desmond had never heard from her before. Not a word, just something slipping loose. 11 years of assumptions rearranged themselves across her face in about 4 seconds, and he watched it happen with no satisfaction at all, only a tired kind of clarity settling into his chest where the panic had been sitting a moment earlier. Trevor's expression went still instead of open. He understood immediately what this meant, not in the abstract, but specifically, that the man he'd just watched get humiliated at a departure gate was the same man whose investment network he'd spent 2 years failing to break into. The boarding pass in his hand seemed to get heavier, and his grip on it loosened just slightly. Desmond told the director clearly that no passenger on that aircraft was to be removed or disturbed, that this was a family matter, and it wasn't going to become the flight's problem. The plane would leave on schedule. Trevor walked down the jet bridge without another word, and the gate closed behind him. Renee, Trevor's absence suddenly very visible, turned back to Desmond and seemed to realize staying was the only move she had left. She tried a different angle almost immediately, her voice sharpening, no longer bothering with the register she'd used for bystanders. She said he'd lied to her for 11 years, that a man who hides $2 billion from his own wife was guilty of something worse than a canceled ticket, that she deserved access to everything that came with being married to him, the lounges, the aircraft, the whole apparatus he'd kept behind glass. Desmond told her, without anger, because he didn't have any left for her that night, that the marriage didn't entitle her to direct his company's aircraft as personal property. He had somewhere to be, and he said it once, plainly, without raising his voice. She shifted to a threat next, said she'd take the story to the press, paint him as a man who abandoned his mother's funeral to stage a power move at an airport, that by the time she finished shaping the narrative, whatever goodwill he had would be buried under it. She believed, he thought, that exposure was still a lever she could pull, that he'd weigh the reputational cost and decide negotiating with her was worth it. What she didn't know was that Denise had already printed the transaction log. It ran 4 pages. It showed Renee had first accessed their shared travel account 2 days before Louise died. She'd checked seat availability on his flight multiple times across those 2 days, watching the window narrow. She'd canceled his reservation within 3 hours of the text where he told her the funeral time. She'd applied the credit to Trevor's upgrade immediately after. At one point, The booking system had flagged the cancellation with an automatic advisory, warning that it would eliminate his only same-day connection with no viable alternative before the following afternoon. She'd clicked past it without pausing. Desmond read the log once and set it down on the counter. Whatever thread of the marriage he hadn't yet let go of, released somewhere in those 4 pages, quietly, without drama, the way something finally settles after being held too tightly for too long. The operations team found a possible route, a small propeller aircraft that could reach a regional airfield 60 miles from Duluth, with a ground vehicle covering the rest. It was tight, but possible, until a second call came in. The airfield had suspended arrivals, a storm system had closed in faster than forecast, and visibility had dropped below the safe approach minimum, the field lacking the instrument infrastructure to support anything less. A coordinator, careful and quiet, mentioned that with direct authorization from Desmond, they could push for an exception, ask a crew to accept conditions outside the normal safety envelope. He didn't say it eagerly, he said it the way experienced people raise an option they already suspect the answer to, because they need to hear it from you directly. Desmond had built Ridgeline on one principle above every other: safety, never bent for anyone, not for a shareholder, not for a deadline, not for himself. Years earlier, before the company had a name, he'd lost an aircraft in a field in South Dakota because someone up the chain approved a departure that didn't clear standard, and everyone survived, but only barely. He'd made himself a promise standing in that field afterward, and he wasn't going to break it tonight, not even for this. No, he told the coordinator. No field gets pressured. No crew gets asked to fly outside the envelope. Not for me. Renee, listening from a few feet away, said if he was really that powerful, he should just give the order and get on a plane, that this was exactly what power was for, to rise above the rules when they got in the way. She said it like it was obvious. Desmond looked at her and said quietly that he wasn't going to put another family through what he was going through tonight, just to save himself an hour. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did the silence that followed. Desmond sat down near the window and took out his phone. The voicemail from his mother was still there, unopened for 2 weeks. He pressed play. Her voice came through, unhurried, warm in that particular way she had of sounding like she was sitting across a kitchen table from him, even through a phone speaker. She said she didn't need him to build anything more, that she was already proud. That wasn't why she'd called. She'd called because she hoped the work hadn't made him forget the way home. She said she just wanted to hear his voice when he had a minute. She said she loved him. The message ended, and the terminal noise around him faded into something distant, the way it does when you've stopped trying to function inside it. He sat holding the brass key in both hands and, for the first time since walking into that terminal, let himself cry, quietly, the kind that comes when you've been holding something too long and your hands finally give out. He had $2 billion in aircraft, terminals, and staff, and none of it could buy back a single minute of the time he hadn't given her. His coordinator came back 11 minutes later, crouching beside him rather than standing over him, which Desmond noticed and appreciated more than he could say. There was a gap in the storm, narrow, the kind that lasts 20 or 30 minutes before sealing shut. A ground crew stationed at the regional airfield had radioed in a visibility reading marginally above the approach minimum, inside the published envelope, not comfortable, but legal, if the flight crew agreed. It wasn't a guarantee yet, just something worth looking at, the coordinator said, and Desmond appreciated that he hadn't dressed it up as more than it was. Ask them, Desmond said. Don't tell them. Ask, explain the whole picture, and let them decide without me in the room. He stood at the window and watched the tarmac while the call was made. Renee had moved to a row of seats near the far wall, arms crossed, saying nothing more to him. There was nothing left worth saying that the transaction log hadn't already said more clearly than either of them could manage. The crew said yes without hesitation once they'd reviewed the numbers themselves. The captain, a woman named Alicia, who'd flown Ridgeline's charter routes for 6 years, sent word that she'd flown tighter windows than this one and would get him there. She didn't know him personally. Most of the people who worked for Ridgeline didn't, but she knew the company's safety record, and she trusted that if they were going, the numbers had genuinely cleared, and that mattered to Desmond more than he could have explained in the moment. The flight took under an hour. Desmond watched the storm laid out beneath the wing, like something that intended to stay a while, gray and white folded together across the whole horizon. The corridor held. Alicia brought them down clean, the kind of landing that makes a difficult approach look like it was never truly in doubt. A four-wheel drive vehicle covered the rest of the distance, snow coming and going in waves, the ground crew driving like they knew every curve by memory, because they probably did. They pulled into the small cemetery outside Duluth just as the pastor began the eulogy. Desmond walked in alone, his jacket damp, snow still clinging to his shoes, and every face turned the way faces turn when a door opens at the wrong moment. He didn't stop to explain himself. He walked to the front, placed his hand on the casket, and stayed there until he was sure his mother knew he'd come. He said a few words afterward that he hadn't prepared and couldn't have repeated if someone had asked him to. About a woman who worked a register for 30 years and gave her son a key that didn't open anything, just reminded him there was always a door home. About how he'd spent a long time building things for other people and hadn't always been careful enough about finding his own way back. Nobody in that church knew he owned an airline. They knew he was Louise's son, and that was the only credential that mattered to any of them. The footage from the gate surfaced online within 2 days, however it started, and it spread fast because it had everything. A wife canceling her husband's flight to his mother's funeral, the line about the dead not checking the guest list, and then the moment the story flipped entirely. Trevor was gone before the Minneapolis trip even ended, and he never called Renee back. He'd never been in love with her. He'd been in her orbit for the access, and the moment that access turned out to be watched over by the very man he'd humiliated, the calculation changed fast, quietly, without a goodbye. Renee called 10 days later. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd been under pressure, that hiding $2 billion from a spouse was its own kind of deception, and she wasn't entirely without a point there. Desmond agreed with that part. He'd kept things from her for reasons that started out defensible and stayed that way too long, and he owned it. But he told her there was a difference between a decision he was prepared to answer for and what she'd done at that gate. Watching a calendar for 2 days, timing it, waiting until he was standing there in person to say it to his face. Don't call something deliberate a mistake, he told her, evenly, without needing to raise his voice to make it land. He filed for divorce the following week and made no move against her professionally. Ridgeline wasn't built to be a weapon, and turning it into one would have betrayed everyone who helped build it, starting with his mother, who'd handed over her own small savings once, decades earlier, along with her trust in a young man with more theory than capital. 4 months later, he started the Homeward Fund under Ridgeline's charitable arm, covering emergency travel costs for people who needed to reach a dying relative or a funeral they couldn't otherwise afford to attend in time. No first class, no upgrades, just real seats on real flights, booked fast for people who'd run out of options. The logo was a small brass key. He drove up to Duluth on a quiet morning that spring, sat by his mother's grave, and told her about it. Not the numbers, just the idea that the company they'd built together with her savings and his stubbornness was going to spend part of its time making sure nobody missed a goodbye because they couldn't afford the ticket. He left the key resting on the stone while he talked, and picked it back up before he drove home. The next morning, he stood at the hangar window and watched the first homeward flight lift off, carrying a young man from Toledo to his father's bedside in Spokane. He touched the key under his shirt, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, he wasn't managing what anyone saw. The man who'd built the company and the boy who used to stand at a hardware store counter waiting for his mother's shift to end were the same person again. I spoke with Mr. Farrow once, months after all of it, and I asked him what he carried forward from that night. He said real power isn't the ability to make people follow your rules. It's the ability to hold your own principles together when everything around you is falling apart, when no one else would know if you cut a corner and you choose not to anyway. He said the hardest thing wasn't refusing to bend the rules for himself. It was learning, too late for some of it, that the people worth keeping close are the ones who never needed the $2 billion to treat you like you mattered. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not status, that truly separates us. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. Thanks for flying with me tonight. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's another flight waiting.